So I really wanted to start off tonight in the proper way that any good coffee talk should. So welcome to Coffee Talk. You're here, I'm here, we'll talk. My mother's getting verklempt. I'm getting a little verklempt. But even without Linda Richmond or Babs, I think nonetheless I was able to pull together a good amount of sources to give us something novel and exciting to learn about for this holiday Shavuot, and about one of our favorite drugs. As Sarah had mentioned, if you have any questions, please throw them in the chat and we'll get to them later on, also for clarification as well. Yeah, so let's just jump in. And I'm going to give you an outline of the session, just so you know, I guess, historically and what to expect about going on here. So we're going to start with a little bit of a poll. You see there are over 130 people in here, which is incredible, a little overwhelming. And then we're going to move into coffee's origin as a beverage, its history as the wine of Islam, and some regulations around coffee throughout the world. And then we're going to dive into the past 500 years of coffee in Jewish life, starting in the 16th century, mostly in Sfat, and then the 17th century in Italy and in Ottoman Istanbul. And then we're going to head over to Prague in the 18th century. 19th century, we're going to move back to Bulgaria. And the 20th century, we're going to head here to the United States and also spend a little bit of time in Israel. Okay, so who are we and where are we coming from? I created a little poll and hopefully this works. Yeah, I think this works. Okay, so if you all wouldn't mind just going through the poll questions, and then we'll get a little bit of a sense of who is here and what this looks like, what our coffee practices are, what our Shavuot history is, and generally just what our thoughts are about this, one of the world's most traded drugs. And while you're filling out the poll, if you haven't had an opportunity to grab yourself a cup of coffee or water or tea, totally recommend it. It's very late. I don't know where you are in the world, but by me, it was quite hot out today, and I know that I never drink enough. So always good to drink some water, especially if you plan on staying up a little bit later than usual. Keep your body healthy and hydrated. And for those that drink coffee, to be caffeinated and get a little buzz going to keep you up all night. So people are still filling out the polls, and now is as good a time as any to just send a little shout out to some of my teachers who have provided me with some incredible resources on my coffee journey. One is Professor Elliot Horowitz of blessed memory. Another is Maoz Kahana, who is a professor, I believe, at Bar-Ilan University. And them, as well as a handful of authors, including Shachar Pinsker, have really been my mentors and guides on this coffee journey of mine. And so really indebted to them. And at the end, I'm happy to share resources and articles for whoever's interested, because there's so much more. We're really just skimming the crema off this topic. I'll give the poll another 10 seconds or so. As people have come in a little bit late, we're just trying to get a sense of what people's experiences are and approaches to coffee. Just to get a sense of the room, there are 140 people in this space right now, and being in a virtual box is sometimes a little alienating. So rather than everyone raise their hands and we're sitting around one of the lovely rooms in the JCC, we're gonna just do this poll. And I think, yeah, 70% voting seems like a good amount for everyone. So let's see. Okay. I think everyone is now able to see these poll results, which shows that about a third of us have not been to a Tikkun Leil Shavuot before. So this is incredible that a third of those who responded, that we're all able to be here and participate in this incredible evening, whether you're here for one session, two, or the entire night. Just kudos to you. That's really awesome. And great of the JCC to be able to empower us to do this. About 10% of people here don't drink coffee. And I don't know if it's appropriate for me to tell you this, but I've been off the bean now for about a year and a half. So I hope you're still willing to hear from me about coffee. I was definitely a hardcore coffee drinker for a while, and I still love it, but not there anymore. And pretty consistent, 70 or 65% of people don't have any changes on holiday or weekday. Most hot coffee drinkers, some people like it with Hawaii or cardamom. And of course, the anti-decaf. I love you all. This is amazing. A pretty good spread on type of coffees we're drinking and where we get our beans. Yeah, all right. This is amazing. I'm really glad we did this. I had no idea if the poll was going to work. Okay, now do I close that so I can actually see everyone? Hello, you're back. Thanks, Robin. Really appreciate that. I don't know if Dina is down with decaf, as in Dina doesn't like decaf, or Dina is like totally like, yes, decaf, let's go. Either way, support it. Do whatever y'all are doing, as long as it keeps you healthy and happy and sane. Dina does not like it. Noted. Totally noted. Awesome. All right. So let's just jump in, because that was just 10 minutes of a lot of fun and great intro. Again, for those that are joining us, if you have questions, throw it in the chat, and Sarah Kay will, when relevant, bring it to the fore and interrupt and go for clarification. So coffee's origin as a beverage. We think of coffee as this thing that has been with us forever, but in fact, people haven't been drinking coffee that we know about until about 500, 600 years ago. The earliest records we have of people drinking ground roasted coffee beans, which is arguably the best way to consume your coffee, is from the 15th century in Yemen. Coffee is from Ethiopia, but somehow it crossed over the sea there, and it was starting to be consumed by Sufi mystics over in Yemen. Then from Yemen through the Muslim world, it traveled throughout the Ottoman Empire and found its way to Istanbul. And then there was the siege in Vienna in 1680s. And then there's the famous story of how the croissant gets its shape, and the Kolschitsky, who is able to rescue these bags of beans from becoming camel fodder. And then we have the Viennese coffee house tradition. And from there, we have all of our favorite cafes and coffee today. And really, to understand coffee, we need to go into what was happening in Yemen and the Ottoman Empire and understand how coffee spread throughout the Muslim world, how this wine of Islam, as it was called, became our favorite Java or mocha, cup of joe, however we refer to it, our daily bread, the thing that perks us up in the morning, keeps us going late at night. In the Arab world and most of Western office culture, coffee is a basic barometer or offer of hospitality, but it wasn't always like this. In the 15th century, coffee was an innovation. It was something new that most people didn't quite understand. We see this in a lot of Jewish responsa literature, Jewish halacha, which is why I'm using this term innovation. And it helps understand how and why coffee got its rocky start and why it wasn't universally accepted. So in the in Islam, grape wine and grapes are forbidden because there's a fear that any grape product, and especially wine, will be alcoholic, which is deleterious or harmful to one's physiology and goes against the precepts established by Muhammad in Islamic law. And so beyond grapes, anything that is distilled, brewed, or fermented into alcohol, so that's beer, that's mead, that's liquor, is also forbidden. Coffee, it treads a line. It definitely isn't alcoholic as we understand it today, but 500 years ago, the effects that coffee had on people seemed to be something that totally changed their physiology in a way that alcohol was also really changing what was happening to individuals and created different social spaces. And this was problematic for a lot of imams and Muslim political and religious leaders. And so starting in 1511 and going through about the 19th century, there have been many moments where coffee and coffee houses have been suppressed. The first and most famous is in 1511 in Mecca. The Egyptian viceroy shut down all the coffee houses and banned coffee because he was afraid of what happens when all these people are getting together and talking. Because we know that when people get together and talk, all of a sudden you're going to have political dissent. I mean, it's just natural here. There's 140 of us. And all of a sudden we had Dina coming in hard on decaf. It's the same thing that the Egyptian viceroy was concerned about in Mecca in 1511. And the same thing that happened in Istanbul in 1633, when the Ottoman Sultan, Murad IV, prohibited coffee houses under penalty of death. If you went to a coffee house and were seen consuming coffee, he said, off with their head. Clearly, the people didn't like this. Most of the Ottoman Empire did not agree with that ruling, but it happened. And it was not unique. This was happening throughout the Ottoman Empire, in Cairo, in Istanbul, in Mecca, in parts of Yemen, throughout the Islamic world. And then even in Sweden and also in Germany, the Prussian Frederick the Great in 1777 shut down coffee because he was afraid that it was cut into beer sales, which are like the national heritage of the Prussians and Germans. And so you have all these moments where people are really afraid of what's going to happen with coffee, whether it's political, whether it's economic or social. If people get together in coffee, there's going to be something bad. The rabbis today would say, if we start drinking coffee, we're going to get mixed dancing. There were different things happening then. And if you read Shachar Pinsker's book that just came out a year and a half ago from NYU Press, whose name is escaping me right now, he talks about all the amazing intellectual, social, political movements that started in coffee houses, how Hebrew modernist literature and all these things are happening because people are getting together around coffee to talk. And this is very much what's happening in the Ottoman Empire that they want to stop, and elsewhere in the world. But I digress because we're here to talk about Jews and their coffee. We're not here to talk about the Islamic Empire. So the earliest mention we have of coffee in the Jewish world is a responsum from the Radbaz, Rabbi David ben Zimra. He was born in Spain at the end of the 15th century, around 1480 or so, and then he moved to Cairo. During his time in Cairo, he became the chief rabbi, a position he held for about 40 years, and then he retired to Tzfat. When he was in Cairo, he wrote a responsa about coffee. If we were in person, I'd give you the source sheet, but we don't have enough time. And in this responsa, he says that coffee is totally allowed to be prepared by a non-Jew. This is a big thing because in Jewish religious circles, food that is cooked by non-Jews, in the Talmud, they have terms like bishul nochri, bishul akum, and bishul goyim. Food that is cooked by non-Jews is often considered not kosher. But the Radbaz, David ben Zimra, says It's not kosher. Coffee is too insubstantial to be this bishul nochri. But though coffee is like fine to be cooked by non-Jews, you can't have it in a coffee house. Why? Because coffee houses are unsavory. You should be studying in the yeshiva. Why are you in a coffee house all the time? Clearly, this is not doing well for your neshama. So if you're having coffee, it can be cooked by a non-Jew, but you shouldn't be doing it in a coffee house. He doesn't say coffee houses are like straight up like verboten, but he says you really shouldn't be drinking coffee there. And however you're going to drink coffee, if you need it for medicinal reasons, it doesn't matter where you're getting it. Coffee is medicine. So we have 1553 thereabouts, responses in Egypt saying coffee, we understand it, we know what it is. You grind up a little bit, you pour it into a cup, as long as it's in a non-Jewish coffee house, and if you need it for medicine, all the time. We'll get into medicine in a little bit, because coffee has really changed our systems for better and for better. In 1580, there is a responsa from Rabbi Moshe Trani, where he mentions a coffee house in Tzfat. This is really important for the development of Tikkun Chatzot, Tikkun Leil Shavuot, which we're going to get to in a moment. But we know that by 1580 in Tzfat, one of the 4 holy cities in the land of Israel, there's a coffee house, which means that the Kabbalists who are living in Tzfat, the students of the Radbaz, which include Isaac Luria, the Ari, and also Yosef Cairo, who is living in Tzfat around the same time that the Radbaz is living in Cairo, that they are aware of coffee. Whether there was a coffee shop when Yosef Cairo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, was in Tzfat, different story, but we know that they're aware of coffee, which is important, and we'll get there after we do a little introduction into the 17th century. Okay, whew. So 17th century, coffee is spreading throughout the Ottoman Empire. And by 1615, the first coffee house that we know about in Italy is opened up. And it's opened up not by a Jew, but by 1632, there's a Jewish cafe in Livorno, or Leghorn, which is how it was known at the period. And then we have in 1650, a Lebanese Jew by the name of Jacob the Jew, as according to all official documents, opens up a coffee house in Oxford. So here, 1650, one of the oldest English language institutions, as well as just higher ed institutions in the world, has a coffee house. And this becomes the start of what are called penny universities, a different lecture. And then in 1697, a couple years after the famed Kolchitsky myth and the Turkish failure at Vienna, we have a fellow by the name of Isaac de Luca, who is an Armenian or Aegean, I'm not quite positive on this, Jew. He opens up a cafe in Vienna. So the second cafe that opens up in Vienna, the first one to open up in the 1680s, is by this fellow Isaac de Luca. And we have already this trade of coffee happening throughout Europe by Italian, Greek, Armenian, Lebanese Jews, which opens up many new ports and Jewish communities to coffee. This becomes important because of what was happening in Tzfat at the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century. Not related to Dean and DeLuca, but that would be amazing. I hear their coffee is incredible, but I'm in Detroit, I don't really know so much. So we're gonna go back now to Tzfat, that we took a little break from, and we're going to continue into the 16th century now that we understand how coffee is spreading around the world. And we have Yosef Cairo and his brother-in-law Shlomo Alkabetz. Yosef Cairo, again, author of Shulchan Aruch, the most comprehensive codification of Jewish law, and the second most important historically beyond Maimonides' Mishnah Torah. And the two of them begin this practice of all-night study sessions in Shavuot in the mid-16th century. So you have in Tzfat, not necessarily a Kabbalistic evening seance or circular ascetic rite, but you have all-night study session being instituted by Yosef Cairo and Shlomo Alkabetz and their followers. A couple of years later, Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Ari, a student of the Radbaz, who we brought up earlier, he starts he doesn't start actually, he popularizes, which were originally happening in Jerusalem, this thing called Tikkun Chatzot, and makes it very popular in the generation following Cairo for Kabbalists. These Tikkun Chatzot are essentially lamentations for the destruction of the Jerusalem. They're mourning their sins, they're praising God in ascetic piety, and they're going on mystical journeys. They're reading Zohar and Midrashim and Talmud. They're reading hymns, supplicatory prayers, slichot, like what people read before Yom Kippur, and they're mourning and they're lamenting. And they're also going on these like pretty weird, trippy adventures because they're staying up all night. Before this 15th century, the night in much of the Western world pretty much ended after 12 hours. You had a 12-hour workday. All of a sudden you have coffee, or in other places there's tea or cola, and all these other caffeinated substances, cacao, that allow the 12-hour workday to move into a 24-hour workday, and that allow these Kabbalists to stay awake, although they're still a little out of it. And so we have this evolution of Tikkun Chatzot, which is broken up into a couple smaller pieces. The Elliot Horowitz article on nocturnal rites is incredible and a must for anyone who's interested in this. And they have these tikkunim that are happening regularly in the evenings. And at the same time, they're also interacting with Yosef Cairo, Shlomo Alkabetz, and their students with their Shavuot midnight study sessions. Is everyone with me on this? We have like midnight study sessions, Tikkun Chatzot, people trying to stay up all night long, people trying to get trippy and feeling and meet the Shekhinah and totally engage with this and lamenting the destruction. And so back to Italy, where we saw the first Jewish coffee house open up outside of the Ottoman Empire. And we have the evolution of another society in Italy that's happening at the same time called Shomrim Laboker, the guardians of the morning. And these were people who would also stay up all night long, and they would be learning Torah, and they would be lamenting the destruction. It wasn't necessarily as deeply involved in Lurianic Kabbalah, Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Ari, that stream of Kabbalah that he popularized. But in the 1620s, shortly after his disciples are spreading out from Tzfat, you see an integration of Shomrim Labokret societies and the Chevra Chatzot, these two different evening learning confraternities is the technical word for this type of group. And you start to see within Italy, in a place where there's a lot of coffee trade happening, a proliferation of these groups. You also see a proliferation of manuscripts that are telling us about different rituals and readings that people are encouraged to do on Shavuot. There was pretty much like a guide in the same way that we have a haggadah that says like, these are the different things. You have your Manish Shana, you have your reading for here, you have your reading over this, different lamentations to try and better connect with destruction of Jerusalem and the reception of the Torah. And in 1655 in Ferrara, Rabbi Nathan Shapiro publishes a book called Tufa Audits. And in it, he very clearly includes readings for an all-night Shavuot learning. And he also includes readings for vigils on Hoshana Rabbah, which most people don't do anymore. And at the same time, there's another book published in Verona. And we see coffee houses, we see all-night learning, we see multiple communities getting involved in this, happening at the same time that coffee is spreading throughout Italy. And we see that Jews are heavily involved in this coffee trade. And from there, as Jews are spreading throughout the rest of the Ottoman world and up into Europe from coffee-centered trading houses in Italy, we see that there is a marked growth in these 24-hour Shavuot learning experiences. And so we have the evening that we are doing tonight. This Tikkun Leil Shavuot can trace its origin all the way back into 17th century Italy and Tzfat, where coffee houses are meeting Kabbalistic circles and people are lamenting and mourning and celebrating the unification with the Shekhinah and spending all night long, because in the morning at the crack of dawn, we are going to be able to receive Torah and have that experience, because we are totally out of it, at least in my mind, totally out of it, and finally able to understand, oh, this is what revelation is like. So I'm gonna take a break from Shavuot for a moment. And if you have questions about all these circles, please throw them in the chat. Again, Sarah Kay will bring them forward at the last 10 minutes of this session. And we're gonna move into the 18th century, into Prague. Prague in the 18th century is like New York City in the early 20th century. Everyone wanted to, everyone was going there because it was so exciting. There were so many opportunities within the Jewish world. All the yeshivas were there. The Maharal was there. Jonathan Eibschitz was there. Prague in the 18th century was hopping. There were Kabbalists, there were Messianic Jews, people who were really into Shabtai Tzvi and that whole movement. There was just incredible wealth and trade. It was relatively safe for Jews. It was a great place to be. And so with that, there's lots of rabbis who are living there who are giving responses, who are passing around halacha and rulings on what is acceptable for coffee. Chief rabbi of Prague at the end of the 17th century is this guy, Abraham Broda. And he says that coffee is forbidden on Passover. Why is coffee forbidden on Passover, according to the chief rabbi of Prague? Because it's a bean. And if you are living in Prague, there is a very good chance that you are an Ashkenazi Jew. And for Ashkenazi Jew, beans are kitniot, which are forbidden on Passover. For Rabbi Broda, he lives in Prague. The coffee at that point in time was mostly being grown in Ethiopia and Yemen. The large French and British and Dutch colonial empires in Indonesia, we call it Java because it was imported from the Java Islands, the large plantations in the Americas, they were not as established at that point, if at all existing. And so Rabbi Broda has never seen a coffee tree before. He has no idea what this is coming from, but he sees this green bean and he's like, oh, this to me looks like it's hummus. It looks like it's fava bean. It's, any of these other kitniot. And by that logic, it is kitniot, and thus it is forbidden. Mind you, you don't eat it in the same way, but it is forbidden. Now, the best part about this responsa is he is very clear, not kosher. But he just throws his hands up in the air because he knows everyone's already drinking coffee on Passover. He's like, it's not accepted, but we do it anyway, and you're not allowed to do it. I don't do it. I may do it, but you're not allowed to do it. And it's one of these things that's happening in Prague at the time where everyone is into coffee. There are, by the 1760s, according to Miles Kahana's research, there are over 8 Jewish-owned coffee houses in the city, not to mention all the other non-Jewish coffee houses. Everyone is drinking coffee, and this guy is like, it's totally not kosher for Passover. Come on, we need our coffee. So we're gonna move a couple decades later to this fellow, Jacob Dreicer, who lived around 1670 to 1733. And he says, you're allowed to have coffee on Passover as long as the person who ground your coffee ground it before Passover and was Jewish. And he says you can totally have it on coffee because I hear they grow on trees. I have no idea what sort of authority in Jewish life today is willing to accept. I hear that it's okay to do that without totally getting into it. But Rabbi Jacob Dreicer, he's into it. I hear they grow on trees. It's acceptable. He's not into the, it looks like a bean, so it should be a bean. So coffee is okay on Passover. But if it was made by a non-Jew, someone that we had heard before from the Radbaz, bishul nochrim or bishul akum, non-Jewish cooked coffee, then not acceptable. All right. Unless it was made by a non-Jew on Shabbat. So now we're like, okay, great. I have my coffee goy, to use our like modern parlance on this, whether that's appropriate or not. That's like a term. I personally am uncomfortable with it, but neither here nor there. So you have a coffee goy to Reb Jacob Dreicer that is like totally acceptable on Shabbat. And you can have that coffee on Passover if it was ground before by a Jew. But you really shouldn't have it in a non-Jewish coffee house because that's going to lead to laziness. Yeah, he says Moshav Litzim, the people who sit and just like are lazy. And so while you can do it, you really shouldn't, because it's Shabbos and you should be studying, you should be learning, you should be reading with your family, you should be fulfilling mitzvahs, but you can do it. All right, so now we're going to skip over to Egypt for one moment just to talk about another rabbi, because coffee is happening throughout the world, and it's really happening in the Arab world. So while Ashkenazim are drinking it, and most American Jews are Ashkenazim, and these are the people that we know about, really coffee is originating in the Sephardi and Mizrahi communities, and they're the ones who are transporting it throughout the world. So they need to be an important voice in this conversation. They're the people who may be telling Dreicer that it grew on trees. So you have this Yaakov Audigy, who lived in Alexandria in Egypt in 1660 to 1730. And he says that you can absolutely drink coffee on Shabbat if you make it in a kli sheni. What's a kli sheni? Kli sheni means a second vessel. And it is a loophole that Orthodox follow in order to ensure that they can have hot liquids or hot beverages on Shabbat. We're not going to go too much into that, but it's important to note that in the early 18th century in Egypt, it's totally understood that coffee is acceptable because of kli sheni. He also says that you should be drinking your coffee with spices in it. We still see this today in Yemen and with Yemeni Jews, and also throughout Israel-Palestine, with people drinking their coffee with hawaj or cardamom, which was part of the poll that we did earlier. And if you have questions about that, please throw them in the chat. Okay, now my favorite source about coffee. And just a shout out to my friend Josh Schwartz in Toronto, who helped me translate and clarify this. There's a rabbi named Zerach ben Meir Edelitz. He lives in Prague in the 18th century. He was a Rosh Yeshiva for like 30 or 40 years. And he's most famous as a darshan, as someone who gave sermons. And most of his sermons, many of his sermons were collected into books, and we have them. One of those books is called the Orli Yesharim. If you go to HebrewBooks.org, it's all there. And on one of the pages in this book, he is lambasting liturgical leaders, cantors, and choirs. He is saying that these people are singing and they're terrible. They're not even like feeling the hymns or the prayers. They're just like obsessed with their voice, and they're so fickle, and it's like a horrible religious space to be in. And then he goes on a tangent. He's like, well, what is this space like? It's like those yeshivot b'tei knesiot shel amei haaretz, which, if one translates this literally, it is like people who sit in the yeshivas and synagogues of the ignoramuses. Or it's the gathering in city houses of the people. And so here, the Rabbi Edelitz is sort of making a pun on the type of lifestyle these people are living. And he's saying that people who are singing without any care in the tune are like people who just go and sit around in the public spaces, which in this case are beer halls, because Prague is famous for its beer halls, and coffee houses. And he's making a pun on the B'tei Knesiot and Yeshivot, because that's where all these Jews are gathering, in the synagogues and the yeshivas, which are in fact beer halls and coffee spaces. And he says, when people are spending all this time in these places, you're going to lead to mixed dancing. The man literally says in his sermon, going to a coffee house is going to lead to mixed dancing. Send me an email later. I'll send you the source highlighted with everything. I want to make this up. I'm not that good. Okay. From there, and looking at the time, I would love to show you my favorite 19th century source, which is by this Bulgarian rabbi, Elliot Papo. And rather than give it to you right now, I'm going to give a plug for my work, which is I work for the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. And if you happen to have the opportunity to register, it's free and accessible. We have all these incredible sources translated into English, including this 1895 responsa talking about the laws of coffee and not going to the coffee houses on Shabbat from Bulgaria. It goes into the medical excuses. It goes into if it can be made by a Jew or a non-Jew. He then talks about making for a Jew or non-Jew on Shabbat. What happens if you drink your coffee with milk? There is just so many good things happening here. Talks about preparations for coffee and Shabbat. So if you're interested in what did they do in the 19th century Bulgaria to make coffee for Shabbat that was kosher, check out this source. But we're going to digress here because we still haven't hit Passover. And I told you all that I would get to Passover. So Passover, 20th century, we're here. 1923 was a big year. It's probably the biggest year for advertising that I'm aware of, because in 1923, the Joseph Jacobs advertising firm strikes a deal with Maxwell House Coffee. And they begin to certify, thanks to Joseph Jacobs being able to persuade an Orthodox rabbi that Maxwell House is kosher, to certify Maxwell House Coffee as kosher. 9 years later, 1932, Maxwell House prints its first haggadah. It's free Passover haggadah that since 1932 has been printed over 50 million times. Yeah, just letting that number sink in there. 50 million free Passover haggadot as a marketing campaign to ensure that Maxwell House Coffee would be seen as kosher and acceptable for American Jews on Passover. I just saw someone wipe their head. Adam, thank you for that. It is, I know, it's shocking. It's overwhelming. And as far as I understand, I'm not a historian of economics in the United States, but this is one of the oldest oldest and longest running advertising campaigns that exist in the United States, if not the world. Okay, a brief journey back into British Mandate Palestine. You have the paramilitary group Palmach, who is hanging out in Arab villages and communities, and they are trying to get to know the land. They dress in the local Palestinian and Bedouin garb, and they're drinking coffee with their Arab neighbors. And they're drinking coffee out of this little pot here, or some manifestation thereof, in tiny little cups. Does anyone know what this pot is called in Hebrew today? If you do, if you could throw it in the chat, that would be so helpful. All right, Finjan, thank you, amazing. Does anyone here know Arabic and know what the word Finjan means? Or know what Finjan is in Arabic? I don't know enough people here. Oh, Ariel, awesome, thank you. The cup for coffee, yes. So the Palmach take this pot and they name it thinking when the Arabs are giving them Finjan Cafe, which is a cup of coffee, they think, oh, Finjan, it's made in here. Like if I were to go to a store and ask for a pour over, like they give me a pour over in a cup and that's my pour over. But really, no, this is a cup and it was made in a pour over. And so we have in like the 1930s and 40s, this Jewish paramilitary group, the Palmach, that is creating a new Hebrew language and also bastardizing an Arab tradition, which is serving coffee in the tiny little cups. Because if you, in Israel, if you ask for Finjan Cafe in Hebrew, you get one of these. But if you go to any Arab community or Arab restaurant and you ask for finjan anywhere in the world, it's a tiny little cup. So just putting that one out there. Ibrik, yes, Ibrik is the name for this. Thank you. Yes, so Ibrik is the Arab name, and there's a different name in Turkish that is escaping me right now, but just wanted to put that out there. Okay, and then in the 1970s and 80s, austerity is gone in Israel, and you have the creation of Café Hafuch. We don't have time to get into that. If you have questions, throw that in the chat. Ami is singing a song from the Palmach. Thank you. And then 1987, we have the creation of the most ubiquitous coffee shop in the United States today, which is led by a Jew from Brooklyn, or it was for a while, Starbucks. And then in the 1990s, we have the creation of third wave coffee. And there's a fellow in Detroit where I am, and it's a perfect time. We're now going to open up for questions. That is a cantor, ordained cantor. And he started up a coffee shop called Chazanos, and decided instead of being a cantor, this was really his calling. I think he still is a cantor and a singer and is wonderful, but now he makes coffee. And not only does he make coffee around the corner from where Judy Lansky lives, but he also makes a coffee soda, whereby you can get your carbonated coffee beverage in a glass bottle, combining the Italian espresso and the little bit of soda water that's served with it, all in one. And so we've gone this full circle way of Italy being the center of coffee distribution in the world, to now we can get any of our buzzwords on our coffee, and we can even get the most iconic Italian espresso all in one. There is so much that is happening in the Jewish world of coffee, and I glossed over a number of sources, but I really want to turn it over to questions. And so I'm going to defer to Sarah Kay, who I believe has been pulling a couple questions.
I have. First of all, that was extremely energizing. That was a very caffeinated kind of delivery. So thank you so much. So the first question in order is, why are you off the bean?
Oh, why am I off the bean? So this is going to be personal. I have, as before the coronavirus shelter in place, I had not been living in any fixed place. I've been living a nomadic lifestyle, and I just don't have a routine. So if I'm in a different city every week or month, it just didn't make sense for me to spend anywhere from $4 to $20 a day at a coffee house as I'm working. I really like working in libraries. It's been very great for my physical, mental health, and for my wallet.
Amazing. What do you think of the coffee at Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks?
I have never loved Starbucks coffee, qua coffee. I just, when I drink coffee, it tends to be just like a cup of black coffee. So whether that is from a filter pot or an AeroPress or Chemex or whatever it is, Americano. And I just never loved the taste of most of the beans at Starbucks. I haven't had most of their new beans. I don't know what that's like. Dunkin', it is so reliable. It's like getting a cup of Tim Hortons. Anywhere in Canada, it's going to taste the same. Anywhere in the United States, a cup of Dunkin' coffee will taste the same. And for $1.25 or whatever it is, that's a great deal. Like the journey that coffee went on from wherever in the world it came from, it's a steal for you to get that value.
Beautiful, thank you. Very inclusive answer. Why is coffee called Joe?
Why is coffee called Joe? I don't know offhand. I can tell you why it's called mocha, and I can tell you why it's called Java, and I can give you a whole host of other names. I can tell you why it's called coffee.
Why is it called coffee?
So in Arabic, it was kahwa. And so it was just a bastardization over trade, and kahwa became cafe. Also, just on the coffee, forgot to mention that people, in addition to consuming the coffee bean, you can also drink coffee husk tea, which is known either as kaskara tea or kishir coffee for Yemenite communities. So there are multiple uses for the different pieces of the coffee fruit. We tend to only have the coffee bean when we drink coffee.
Very sustainable, maybe, to use the whole bean. When did women start drinking coffee?
Oh, thank you. So one of the pieces that I glossed over from the Prague Pinkasim of the 18th century is in 1764. There is an ordinance written in the Pinkas. Pinkas are the minute books of Jewish communities. And as Maoz Kahana in his research explains, there's an ordinance in 1764 that says women are forbidden from meeting in coffee houses, which means women were going to coffee houses and women were drinking coffee. There's no reason for an ordinance unless it happens. So, at the very least, at that point in time, women in Prague are doing this. I would like to assume that women are also a part of the coffee trade even earlier, helping their husbands selling in the streets or preparing, roasting, and everything else. And especially in the wealthy families throughout the Middle East and Italy, like it is very common for salons and for women's groups to be meeting in a space where coffee would actually be present. Can't guarantee that it's there, but we have anecdotal evidence to indicate that it probably was.
Can you speak to how the Kabbalists prepared coffee in those early days, if they were also sort of traditionally observant?
So I wonder if that question has something to do with like how they would prepare it for a holiday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so there's a lot of responses from the 17th century in North Africa as well as Italy that indicate that coffee was essentially made very similar to what we think of as like Turkish coffee. So grounds would be mixed in with hot water. Generally, that pot would sit for hours over a fire. It was not something like you boiled it once and then you took it off and then you boiled it. There wasn't the dance of the pot. And so, but we do know that they were grinding coffee and putting in water. On Shabbat and holidays, they would use the kli sheni. I had mentioned a responsa by Yaakov Audigy in Alexandria. And essentially they would pour from their like big pot of water that's in the fire into a second cup. And then from that second cup, they could then dust on a little bit of coffee, or they would have a coffee concentrate sitting from the night before, and they would pour the kli sheni water into that and essentially give that a warming boost. Sometimes they would also just have cold coffee concentrate. And it's important to note that the coffee that people were drinking 100 years ago tasted significantly worse than any coffee that we are likely to drink today, because we are so much better at roasting. And one of the reasons that they would drink coffee with spices is that it allowed for consistent tasting cup.
Gotcha. Okay. Somebody, that is a beautiful answer. I love the idea of there being like almost like a sourdough starter. You have like the coffee mother that you're constantly like stewing.
Or your Gentile coffee house is stewing.
Right, somebody's stewing. Somebody would like to know more about how sort of coffee and politics in Central Europe came together. I don't know if that's something you can speak to.
Yeah, so there's an incredible book by Shachar Pitzker that really speaks to this book. It's called A Rich Brew. And that speaks to mostly the 19th century and also the beginning of it really starts with the Enlightenment and focuses in on different cities and hubs and how you would have socialist cafes, you would have anarchist cafes, you'd have cafes where it was Yiddishist or it was Hebrew, or they were like, it was the Polish Jewish literati, and everything about these spaces was highly charged. And you also can think about the French Revolution, which as much as Les Mis shows as happening in bars, it was very much happening in cafes. And cafes were sources of intellectual exploration. I highlighted them at the very beginning, penny universities, but cafes very much were a place where people were able to sit and talk. And that's why they were threatened in the Ottoman Empire and in Germany and elsewhere throughout the world, because people were afraid of people sitting down and talking, and they weren't drunk. They were rather lucid, they were hyper and excited, and they could spend all night doing this.
Several people have asked if there's a way that we can get in touch with you since you've only generated even more questions. Do you have like an email address or a website, some way that we could get a hold of you going forward?
Yes, so I'm putting my email in. This is my personal email. So try not to bombard me too much. Don't sign me up to your listservs. And I'm happy to follow up with anyone. Also, if you prefer to follow any of my coffee adventures, my handle for social media. So there we go. You'll also find my great new baking adventures. And now that I have time and I'm not nomadic, I have a kitchen. Dusted that off from 2014. So enjoy. Looking forward to your questions. If you could just like say in the subject, like, oh, coffee talk, that'll like clue me in.
In our last minute together, do you have suggestions for people of like one new way they might try coffee or something they might add a little, like, do you have any like a stretch assignment for us?
Yeah, so echoing a question that you had asked a moment ago of what was the way that that religious Jews were drinking coffee. And what is a way that we can actually get into our coffee is to potentially find green beans, take out a frying pan, roast them in your kitchen, and just get a sense of what is it like to be in a space where coffee is roasting. And then whether you have an empty wine bottle or a rolling pin or a mallet to grind that up, or even better, a mortar and pestle. And if you have a spice grinder, that works perfectly. Throw that into a pot with a little bit of water and make it like Turkish coffee, make it like Greek coffee, not to be too political about it, but like, it's the same thing. Look at YouTube to find some clues at how to do that, whether you want to take it off the pot 2, 3, 4 times, and give that a feel. There's like so much to be said about having coffee being a very like sensational experience. Like it really is about smelling. When are the beans done roasting? Mm. It's a sense of like you hear it. When does it crack? A lot of roasters will talk about first crack and second crack when they're talking about roasting coffee. So here you have the opportunity, take like a big fistful of beans and throw that in your frying pan. It'll cost you $4 and you'll be able to meet someone who is importing beans into your neighborhood, whether it's a cafe or someone else. And I think it's a really great opportunity to find
beautiful.
Your own coffee preferences and to just get something a little fun out of your quarantine or sheltering in place.
I'm also hearing almost like a call for mindfulness. Like think about this process that normally you come in at the very end. What would it be like to sort of ground yourself in the beginning of it?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Avery, this was spectacular. Thank you so much. You've given us an enormous amount to think about. This was beautiful. Chag Sameach, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Chag Sameach to you all as well. I hope your coffee and Shavuot just continues to overflow.